The blockchain is a data structure, it's a database that takes advantage of a whole bunch of little incremental innovations in computer science, things like the distributed hash table, and bolts them together in a form that creates a database with some new properties. People talk about immutability, and what they really mean is many, many, many copies of the data with a sort of relationship between the copies and a relationship with the past, which make it impossible to edit the data in a way which is not immediately tamper obvious. And a good example of this would be, for example, the history of Wikipedia. Right now, if you go to a Wikipedia page, you can click a button marked history, and it will give you a long list of all of the edits that have been made through time. But what you don't know is whether some sneaky admin in Wikipedia or a state-sponsored hacker reaches into that database and silently alters the past. And of course, Huxley leads to Orwell. The primary activity of control in Big Brother society is to edit the past, to change what happens in the present by retelling people their history in new forms. And the blockchain is an extremely powerful counter to this. And I think that all of the information in society that we want to have this kind of durability and resistance to attack will be stored in blockchains or roughly equivalent structures to blockchains. It's my opinion that innovation tends to happen at the edges. So you get this kind of plucky gang of stalwart anarchists that decide the first use for the blockchain is to create a central bank of the internet. And that project is called Bitcoin. I think in the long run it will be seen as being basically an extremely innovative temporary folly. But when you see the Bank of England, for example, talking about issuing RS coin, which is solid English pounds on a blockchain used for settlement between banks, you can see that that's a direct descendant from the thinking embedded in Bitcoin. The internet anarchists got the basic principles correctly enough that the entire world is moving rapidly in that direction for reasons of efficiency, but also because it provides a much higher criteria for auditability and for accountability. The place where this becomes interesting is when we begin to examine the other areas of life in which there's a large accountability gap, where we know that terrible things are happening, but we don't seem to be able to corral the data about these things in a way that gives us leverage. And this gets very deeply into the heart of evidence-based policymaking, and evidence-based policymaking is basically the soul of the world when it comes to things like climate change. Our ability to actually get coherent understanding of the evidence is our ability to take difficult measures in hand to be able to change the outcomes on things like climate. So one area that's of specific interest to me on this is drug trials. And right now, there's an enormous tendency to simply never publish data sets or results which are not in the favor of the drug companies sponsoring the trials. Unpublished work just piles up in corners. Well, there's not really much of a strong effect. Let's do this again until we get something to move. And obviously, this seriously sabotages the statistical basis of those trials. It makes it much harder to understand what medications work and what medications don't. And we can assume that through the rest of science, there is a strong tendency towards that kind of casual discarding of unfavorable data. Now, we can't necessarily put a total stop to that, but the idea that you would take all of the data that ran through a piece of scientific equipment and log all of it into a blockchain, so that it was possible to then match all the runs that were made with the data that was published and say, okay, we've got very large anomalous sets of measurements that were made here. Was there some trial that had statistically significant results that were then discarded? You could begin to look towards this kind of clean room, white glove, sterile approach to managing large scientific data sets. And I think that the idea that you could basically get to a higher standard of proof in science because you know what questions were asked, not simply what answers were recorded, I think there's some very interesting steps in that direction. The other place where this kind of circles around comes about to the question of trust in the state. We are fortunate enough to live in a country where the vast majority of the real ugly bloodshed about civil rights happened many generations ago. Right? Our forefathers fought extremely hard for the equilibrium that we now have, and that equilibrium is serviceable. It's far from perfect, but it's produced a fairly decent approximation of rule of law for a very long time. But in the rest of the world, the saying that a prince is but a stationary bandit makes much more sense. The kleptocracies of the developing world, I think, are particular targets for this. And the failure of international aid to produce any of the results that you would have hoped to see from international aid, I think largely comes down to transparency issues of a kind that are entirely soluble in, for example, open data around spending. So I quite like the idea that you could take situations in which you have an enormous number of untrustworthy actors, and you can lay down a layer of very, very strong technical trust as a way of basically answering that most fundamental human questions: where's the money? And if we had aid protocols that ran on those kind of principles, so that you could track the spending to the penny for every single item with total transparency about whose hands it passed through, we might finally see an international aid process that was actually helpful.